Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's a delight to be invited back. The last time I was here was, as I think the dean said, 3 years ago. And at the time, if memory serves, I talked about getting drunk, about drinking and getting drunk, and how I thought that universities should teach their undergraduates how to drink properly. And so I'm a little surprised that I got invited back after that. But this time, I wasn't given any freedom in what I could talk about. I was told I really had to talk about proof. So after some reluctance, I decided, all right, I'll talk about proof. So that's obviously a big topic. So I thought that this afternoon I would start by asking a relatively simple question, which is, what level of proof do we need about the harmfulness of some activity before we act, right? Obviously, we never act against something that we think is wrong unless we have some evidence. If somebody called Obama tomorrow and said, in Canada right now they're massacring all left-handed people, Obama wouldn't invade Canada the same day, right? He would say, I'd like to have some evidence before I act. I think we're right to ask for evidence before we should. In fact, it is improper and reckless to act in the absence of evidence. But I think that there are times and cases in our society when we ask for too much evidence before we act. I think sometimes we use the desire for proof as an excuse not to do anything. And as a result of that, I think there are lots of cases where we let people suffer when they shouldn't, when they needn't have to suffer. Now, I realize that that's a pretty bold and vague claim, but I want to illustrate it by giving you two examples, one from the not-too-distant history, and one from today that involves everyone in this room and everyone at this university. Let's start with a case from the past. It involves a guy named Frederick Hoffman. And Frederick Hoffman is a really unusual figure. He was born in Germany in 1865 and immigrates to this country as a young man and does all kinds of odd jobs. He's homeless for a while. And finally, he gets a job in his late 20s with the Prudential Insurance Company and rises to a quite high level at that company, becomes the senior statistician for Prudential. Now, you should know that at that time in the early part of the 20th century, insurers are incredibly powerful institutions in this country, far more powerful than they are today. This was an era before Medicare, before Medicaid, before Social Security, before any kind of private health insurance. Working class families in this country relied on insurance companies to pay for things like to take care of their family if they were to die young, to take care of their burial expenses, to cover some portion of their healthcare costs. And so if you were a working class family at the turn of the last century, somebody would come to your door, someone from one of the major insurance companies would come to your door every week, and you would give them a nickel for every person in your household, and that would be your insurance policy, right? And there were basically two insurers that mattered in the beginning of the 20th century. One was Metropolitan, MetLife, and the other was Prudential, the company that Frederick Hoffman worked for. And this was also, at the beginning of the last century, a time before we had any kind of organized collection of health statistics. You know, today, if you want to know exactly how many Americans had breast cancer last year, you can look it up. If you want to know exactly how many Americans died of a heart attack last year, you can go on the internet and you can find that in 30 seconds. There was none of that collection of data at the beginning of the 20th century. All we had was the census that took place every 4 years that gave us a kind of overall sense of how many Americans they were and what they did for a living. But every other bit of evidence about the kinds of illnesses that Americans suffered, how long they lived, what sort of diseases they had, all that stuff was scattered all over the place, was found in 1,000 different places. And the only institution in the country with the means and the motivation to gather that kind of evidence were the insurers. And that's what Frederick Hoffman did. He set out and he would cover the entire country and he would go and visit towns and cities and villages all across this land, and he would interview doctors and hospitals and funeral directors, and he would visit all the major employers, and he would go to the cemeteries, and he would talk to people, and he would walk around the town, and he would try and get a sense of what people are dying of. And he would look at the local industries, and he would say, well, how does the mortality rate in this particular industry compare to the national average? Because he was trying to get a sense of whether the people in that town were insurable. And if they could be insured, what should their premium be? And Hoffman, in the course of this work in the early 20th century, makes a series of extraordinary contributions to our understanding of health and disease. For example, he is the first person to draw a link between cigarette smoking and cancer. 50 years before that information was confirmed by medical sciences, Hoffman wrote a paper in 1915 saying, from my evidence that I've gathered, there is almost nothing more injurious to your health than cigarette smoking. He also did a lot of work on Indian reservations in sort of giving us a picture of the health of native peoples. But perhaps his most important contribution was in our understanding of what was then called miner's asthma, or what is today called black lung disease. Coal mining at the turn of the 20th century was an enormous industry. It was one of the most important industries in the entire country. Coal is what powered the railroads, it's what heated people's homes, it's what generated electricity, it's what powered all the ships in the sea. The coal industry was among the largest and most lucrative and most important industry in the entire country. And one of the inescapable facts about coal mining was that it generated a lot of dust. When you're working inside a mine and you're chipping away at a seam of coal, in the process of extracting that coal from the ground, you would generate all kinds of particles of coal, and they would be in the air, right? And even more so, every coal mine had a room at the top of the mine called the breaker. And the breaker is where the coal that was brought up from below was cleaned of all of its impurities and was broken up into the right size, into the kind of size of the coal that you would sell. And breaker rooms where thousands of people would work, many of them children, by the way, were incredibly dusty. There was so much dust in a breaker room that if I was standing here in a breaker room, I couldn't see the other side of the stage. It was so dust that you could barely see your own feet when you were working there. And the issue around coal mining that had been a big issue ever since coal mining became important at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was, did it harm miners to inhale coal dust? Right? Now, everyone was in agreement that miners inhaled coal dust. There was no question about that. In fact, as far back as 1830, doctors had done all of these examinations of miners who'd been mining for 10 or 20 years about what happened to them when they woke up in the morning. And what would happen is they would have a coughing fit, and in their coughing fit, they would cough up black, inky spittle, right? Which was basically the contents of their lungs mixed in with a lot of coal dust. And it was disgusting, right? And they would cough more and more of it the more they mined and the more time they spent in the coal mines. That was absolutely beyond question. The thing that no one could agree on was whether that was dangerous. Did it harm the health of someone to inhale all of this dust from coal mining? And the coal miners said that it did. They were, from the very beginning of coal mining, said, look, this is killing us, right? This is a serious problem. By the time we're 40 years old, we're having these coughing fits and coughing up essentially black ink, and this is not good for living a long and healthy life. But the medical community and the coal mining companies had a very different position. For years and years and years, they would look at this and they would say, you know what, we've studied this issue and we don't think it's a problem. And they had all kinds of arguments. One of their arguments was, look, if you look at coal miners very closely, you'll see that they have far lower rates of other kinds of respiratory diseases. So there was a claim made that tuberculosis, which was one of the great killers of people around the world, and particularly Americans in the 19th century, they said tuberculosis rates are lower among coal miners. So the suggestion was that something in that coal dust that they were inhaling was protecting them against a far worse disease. Right? Other people said, you know, maybe the dust particles are shaped in such a way that they're pretty harmless. You know, it's possible that certain things you inhale can harm your lungs, but this is a different kind of animal. It's something that's quite innocuous. Other people said, look, if you're coughing up all of this coal dust, then that's a sign of your body working, right? The system's working. You've got dust inside your lungs, but then you're getting rid of it through your coughing. And that means that maybe in the end, the health effects of inhaling all this dust are not so bad. So for years and years and years, nobody paid particular attention to the problem of coal dust because they had all of these arguments that they used to convince themselves that it wasn't a health risk. And then along comes Frederick Hoffman. Now, Hoffman is interested in this issue because he works for the Prudential Insurance Company. They insure lots and lots of miners. It's a big business of theirs. There are hundreds of thousands of miners in America in the turn of the 20th century. And they really want to know, are these people dying young? Because if they're dying young, we have to charge them a higher premium. So Hoffman goes and he examines this issue. And in 1918, he publishes this famous report. It was called Mortality from Respiratory Diseases in the Dusty Trades. And it comes out, it was published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, by the government, federal government, in 1918. And basically what he says is that everything the medical community and the coal mining companies have told you about miners' asthma is wrong. First of all, he looks at the statistics and he says, there is no evidence whatsoever that miners have lower rates of tuberculosis than anybody else. None. That's a statistical illusion, right? So if you think there's something magically protective about the dust particles these guys are breathing in, you're kidding yourselves. Then he says, he looks at autopsies of the lungs of dead miners, and he points out that in a typical miner, a third of their lungs will be covered in coal dust, will be sodden with coal dust. Right? Whereas if you take an autopsy and look at the lungs of someone who wasn't a miner, maybe 1% of their lungs will be covered in coal dust. And if you take those two lungs, if you take the lungs of the healthy person, the non-miner, and you put them in water, they'll float. And if you take the lungs of someone who was a coal miner and you put them in water, they'll sink. And he says, if you want to believe that there's nothing harmful about inhaling lots of coal dust, you have to believe that that test, one sinking and one floating, doesn't matter. Right? He says, I don't buy it. Then he looks at the death rates from asthma. Asthma would be, you'd think, would be something that would be linked, if you've got a lot of stuff in your lungs, asthma is a relevant disease to look at. And he looks at asthma and he says, look, coal miners are dying of asthma at a rate 5 times higher than other working age men. That's significant, right? 5 times is a big deal. And then he looks at the census figures and he says, if you look at men who are farmers, about 29% of them are still working after the age of 45. But if you look at miners, only 17% of them are working after the age of 45. If mining is really a healthy profession, where are all these men going, right? Why are they disappearing from the profession if it's supposedly so healthy? So he adds all this up and he says, look, I don't buy it. I think that this miner's asthma thing is something that we should be concerned about. So here we have the senior statistician from one of the most powerful and important institutions in the country, publishing a report on the health of workers in one of the most important and critical industries in the country, and saying there's a problem. So what do you think happens? Nothing happens. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. And why does nothing happen? Because all kinds of people stood up and read Hoffman's report and said, you've got no proof. And it was true. The only way to tell with certainty whether coal dust is killing miners is to conduct a formal study, is to take a very large group of men who are working in a non-mine, working on a farm, and take an equivalent group of men who are working in the mines, follow them for 30 years, make a note of every illness they come up with and when people die and how they die, and at the end of that study, break open your blinded data and see who's dying faster than the other group, right? That's the way you get proof. Did Frederick Hoffman do that? No, he didn't. What he did was he rounded up little bits of evidence from here and there and said, this is what I believe. But let's be clear about one thing, that when Hoffman's critics said that they didn't believe him because he didn't have enough proof, Is that what they really meant? Right? I think if you believe that, you're being naive. There was more than enough evidence in his report to suggest, at the very least, that coal dust was something that was problematic, and that inhaling coal dust was a problem to be taken seriously, and at the very least, we should be studying this problem and figuring out what we should do next. But the real truth, the real reason all of those critics told him that he didn't have enough proof, is they were using the notion of proof as an excuse not to do anything, right? Solving the problem of coal dust was difficult. It meant you had to completely restructure the way you designed a coal mine. You had to put in all kinds of ventilation shafts, right? It meant you had to change the design of the breakers. It meant it was going to be difficult. It was going to be expensive. It was going to be inconvenient. So the mining companies, who didn't want to go through all of that rigmarole, simply shrugged and said, look, you know, coal mining it's a dangerous business. It's inherently dangerous. There's no getting around that. Miners know what they're getting into. There are risks in any human activity. There's no sense in getting in a panic over some possible hypothetical health risk. So nothing was done. The industry hems and haws in the wake of Hoffman's report, and they go into this protracted period of denial and confrontation. And do you know how long it took for the mining industry to finally own up to the health consequences of miners' asthma or black lung disease? 50 years. It was not until the 1970s that people suddenly realized that tens of thousands of miners were dying horrible deaths, vastly prematurely, because of the dust they inhaled while working in the mines. Right? Now, I think we can all agree that that is an appalling story, right? That should never have happened. The number of people who suffered needlessly because of this demand for proof is astronomical. We should have acted on this in 1918. Instead, we acted on this in 1975. We look around the room and we say to ourselves, we would never do that, would we? We're much too educated and sophisticated and empathetic to ever look at the suffering of someone else and say, oh, we're not going to act until we have proof. Right? But we do that. All of us do that. Everyone in this room is doing that, even as we speak. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about football. What do we know about football? We know about football approximately what Frederick Hoffman knew about coal dust in 1918. We know that the act of playing tackle football, right, of players repeatedly receiving blows to their head, results in some percentage of football players in profound long-term injury. Your brain is a big piece of soft tissue floating inside of a very, very hard skull. And when you receive a blow to your head, what happens is that tissue bangs up against the side of your skull, and that banging causes bruising and causes blood vessels to tear, and eventually, if it happens often enough, and a typical offensive lineman might receive blows to the head 1,000 times in one season, if that happens enough, it results in atrophy of the brain tissue. The disease in question is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE is the short term. CTE is, I'm sure you've all heard about it, is Alzheimer's on steroids, right? It causes, first of all, it starts with behavioral and personality changes, then disinhibition and irritability, then dementia, and then death. It is a truly horrible way to die. If you look at the brain of someone who has been diagnosed with CTE, it looks like desiccated fruit. It's just about as scary a thing as you'll ever see. If Alzheimer's is degeneration of the brain brought on or augmented by age, then CTE is degeneration of the brain augmented by injury. And every year that passes, the list of football players who we now know to have suffered from this terrible illness gets longer and longer. Right? Just last year, Junior Seau, one of the greatest linebackers in the history of professional football, shot himself in the chest at the age of 42. When they autopsied his brain, what did they find? CTE. The great Pittsburgh Steelers center, Mike Webster, died homeless in 2002. Right? A guy who made millions of dollars in his life ended up dying under a bridge in Pittsburgh. They autopsied his brain. What did he have? CTE. Right? Terry Long, an offensive lineman for the Steelers, killed himself in 2005 by drinking antifreeze. What did they find when they looked in his brain? CTE. Justin Strelznick, another football player, drove his car at 90 miles an hour into a tanker truck. What did they find? CTE. Andre Waters used to play in this city, was an all-pro safety for the Philadelphia Eagles, shoots himself in the head, and they managed to get enough pieces of his brain to do a diagnosis of what? CTE. Dave Duerson, all-pro safety for the Chicago Bears, shoots himself in the chest a couple years ago. What do they find? CTE. I could go on. I've listed only a tiny fraction of the players who just in the last several years have suffered horrible deaths, and upon examination we see in their brain the marks of the results of years of trauma from playing football. Now, what should we do about that? Well, I don't know about the pro game, but I think that on the basis of what we can see has happened, this strikes me as a very strong case for stop playing football at the university and high school level, right? At least until we figure out more about just how widespread this particular problem is. It's not as if football is some crucial part of the educational mission of colleges and high schools, right? If you told me that some portion of a class studying physics would someday come down with dementia as a result of their studies, I would say, well, that's a hard call. Should we ban physics or not? We kind of need physics, right? This is not physics. This is a game. It's entertainment. It has no connection whatsoever to the function of universities. When people die of a dumb and violent 19th century game that serves no educational function, I think the obvious thing to do is to stop playing the dumb and violent 19th century game. But here's the problem. We're still playing the dumb and violent 19th century game. The facts about CTE have been known now for years. And every year that passes, we get more and more evidence from prematurely dead football players about the reach of this terrible disease, and yet schools across the country continue to play football. Now, why is this? I've actually been very curious about this in recent months. So I've started to have conversations with senior people at universities and high schools about why they continue to play football. And the first answer I get, the private answer, is, well, we continue to play football because if we got rid of football, the alumni would go crazy, right? It would cripple our fundraising. We have to have football. Now, I'm not sure that argument even merits a response. The best thing that can be said about it is that it's not an argument. The function of a university is not to maximize contributions from its alumni, right? The function of a university is to prepare its students to have a healthy and fulfilled life as adults. If you're willing to risk permanent injury to your own students because you want to raise money from your alumni, you're in the wrong business, right? You should be doing something else. The next argument is no better. It's, you know, after people I talk to have gone on and on about how we couldn't do that, the alumni would, they say, well, you know, football's an inherently risky game. Lots of things in life are risky. People should be allowed to assume risks in the course of doing something they love. Totally true. I agree with that. But if that's the case, then why don't we actually treat football like an inherently risky discipline, sport, right? I would be happy if then colleges sat down with every freshman before they started their first game as a football player and made them sign an agreement which said something like this. In agreeing to play college football, you are incurring a real but unknown risk of dementia, depression, and early death. There is no known cure for this condition. Should you suffer from dementia, we would ask that you have your family donate your brain to our medical center for analysis, and if evidence of CTE is found, we promise to compensate your estate accordingly for wrongful death pain and suffering, medical expenses, and lost income. I would be happy. I would withdraw my requirement that we stop playing football if everybody was signing that waiver before their first game. Last I checked, nobody is. Then there's a third argument, and this is the argument that always gets me. They say, who says football is dangerous? Who says CTE is killing people? You've got no proof. You know what? They're absolutely right. We don't have proof. We don't know how many players have developed CTE. This is a condition that can only be diagnosed upon autopsy, right? You've got to die before we know whether you've got CTE, and you have to donate your brain to some kind of scientific center so we can take a look at it. We know that every professional football player who has died under these sorts of circumstances has been found to have CTE in their brain, but we have no clue about what the prevalence of this disease is. It could be 1% of football players. It could be 20% of football players. I've heard figures as high as that. But all we know is that when you look at two teams playing football on a field, chances are that someone on that field is going to die a horrible death well before their time because of their playing football. That's all we know. Do we know how many times you have to get hit in the head before you develop CTE? We don't. No clue. We know that the majority of players who have been diagnosed with this condition are people who spent many years in the NFL, right? So it suggests to us that there is some connection between the total number of hits you take to the head and your chances of coming down with this illness. But then again, a not inconsiderable portion of people who've been diagnosed with CTE have been either college players or even players who only played in high school. So clearly, it's a more complicated question than it looks, and there may be some other vulnerabilities that make certain kinds of people more likely to come down with this disease than others. We don't know what they are. Right? Do we know that cracking down on concussions and treating them promptly and properly would severely slow the onset and course of this disease? We don't. We know that there are two kinds of hits you get on a football field. One is the traumatic hit, the concussion, which has immediate consequences, and the other are repetitive subconcussive impacts, the little hits that a lineman will get on absolutely every play in absolutely every practice and game. We don't know which one is more important. Some people say this is about concussions. Some people say, no, they're a red herring. This is really about repetitive subconcussive impacts. In other words, you can solve the concussion problem, and it may be the case that this CTE continues to be an issue. We don't know. Right? The point is, there are lots of things we don't know about this disease. But let's be clear, calling for proof in this case is an excuse. Right? It's an excuse for inaction in exactly the same way it was an excuse for inaction after Frederick Hoffman came out with his 1918 report on miners' asthma. Because what are the supporters of football saying? They're saying the same thing that coal companies said at the turn of the century. They're saying, well, getting rid of football would be difficult. It would be costly. It'd be inconvenient, right? So what do? They shrug and they say, well, football is an inherently dangerous business. There's no getting around that. Football players know what they're getting into. There's no sense getting into a panic about some hypothetical health risk. So what happens? Nothing happens. Nothing's done. And what happens when nothing is done? The same thing that happened in the coal mines 100 years ago. People die horrible deaths. You know, every year I live in New York. Every week I go and work at the Bobst Library at New York University. And it's this 10-story building that has a huge atrium in the middle. And in 2003, 2 students went up to one of the high floors and jumped over the railing and committed suicide, jumping into the atrium. And the university did not wait. They didn't conduct a study. They didn't call in epidemiologists to determine if the suicide rates at Bobst were any higher than any other facility on their campus. What they did, they act. What they did was they act. They immediately put up plexiglass screens that blocked anyone from jumping over the balcony into the atrium. And then 3 years ago, a student on the 9th floor climbed up over the plexiglass screen and jumped to his death in the atrium. And what did NYU do? They didn't conduct a cost-effectiveness exercise to see what further improving the suicide prevention barriers was going to cost them. They didn't bring in anyone to do an analysis of whether this would actually lower the suicide rate on campus. No, they didn't know the answers to those questions, but not knowing the answers to those questions didn't stop them from acting. So what they did is they went, and at a cost of tens of millions of dollars, put in a full-length aluminum screen that stretches from the bottom all the way to the top, that makes it absolutely impossible for anyone to commit suicide at Boap's Library anymore. You know, they didn't stop at all that and gather all that evidence first because they believed correctly that sometimes we are called to act in the absence of absolute proof. Now, there was a suicide on this campus 3 years ago. I'm sure some of you remember it. A guy named Owen Thomas, who was 21 years old, was a junior at Wharton, grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, not so far away. And Owen Thomas was the captain of the Penn football team. And when they sent his brain to be analyzed, do you know what they found? They found CTE in a 21-year-old. Let me read to you from the article on his death in the New York Times. Owen Thomas, a popular 6'2", 240-pound junior lineman for Penn, with no previous history of depression, hanged himself in his off-campus apartment after what friends and families have described as a sudden and uncharacteristic emotional collapse. Doctors at Boston University subsequently received permission from the family to examine Thomas's brain tissue and discovered early stages of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a disease linked to depression and impulse control. Right? The article continues, Thomas never had a diagnosis of a concussion on or off the football field, or even complained of a headache, his parents said, although they acknowledged he was the kind of player who might have ignored the symptoms to stay on the field. Because of this, several doctors said his CTE, whose only known cause is repetitive brain trauma, must have developed from concussions he dismissed or from the thousands of subconcussive collisions he withstood in his dozen years of football, most of them while his brain was developing. So what did Penn, your university, do in response to the suicide of Owen Thomas? Did they put up the equivalent of an aluminum screen? No. They honored him before the season opener the next year against Lafayette. Am I the only one who finds that appalling? That's like the owner of a coal mine in 1900 giving out gold watches to miners who died of black lung disease. Here's what your university spokesman said after Owen Thomas's suicide. While we will never know the cause of Owen Thomas's depression and subsequent suicide, we are aware of and deeply concerned about the medical issues now being raised about football head injuries, and will continue to work with the Ivy League and the medical community in addressing these issues. Owen's untimely death was a terrible tragedy, and we continue to grieve for his loss. Where to start? Let's start with the statement, we will never know the cause of Owen Thomas's depression and subsequent suicide. Are you kidding me? What is there more to know? A healthy young man with no previous history of depression hangs himself in his apartment, and when they do an autopsy on his brain, they find he has the beginnings of a debilitating neurological disorder caused by taking too many hits on the football field. And then, the statement, we are aware and deeply concerned about the medical issues being raised about football head injuries. Can you believe that? Right? We are so aware and deeply concerned about the medical issues being raised about football head injuries that 3 years after Owen Thomas's death, Penn continues to play football. In my book, that does not count as concern. That is moral indifference. So what should you do? Right? What should Penn do? Well, actually, a better question is, what should you do? Well, it's your classmates who are dying, right? It's your classmates who are putting their lives at risk by playing this game. I think all of you has to consider boycotting football games at Penn. And I think you have to convince your friends to boycott football games at Penn. And I think you have to pick it outside football games at Penn. And I think you have to go to the administrators of this university and you have to ask them, why is a world-class institution, one of the finest universities of higher learning in this planet, exposing its own students to the risk of injury and death? And if they ask for proof, tell them you don't need proof. Sometimes proof is just another word for letting people suffer. Thank you. Yeah.
We have time for questions. There are stationary mics in the aisles. Those with questions, please line up. One on the left, one on the right. Let the conversation continue.
Thank you for being here. It's much appreciated. On your website, you talk about the two different hats that you wear for your different writings, one as an author for your books and another in the New Yorker. And that was published back in 2004. What has changed based on that over the course of almost a decade?
I don't think much. I think that the job of a journalist, which is what I am, is simply to examine the world that I see it and ask questions. And I don't think it matters whether you ask the questions in a book or in an article or in a talk before a group of people. I think it's all the same. Just as it doesn't matter if a musician plays a piece of music on a record, on a CD, or live before an audience.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Gladwell, Malcolm. I don't know, whichever you prefer.
Malcolm.
Malcolm. My name is Daniel. I'm a sophomore here. And longtime fan. I'm particularly fond of your conversations with Bill Simmons over email. My question is regarding the benefits of football. Mm-hmm. I think that you did a very good job showing what the costs of playing football and hosting a football team at the university are. And you named several examples of people who died or killed themselves because of football. But what about the people like Robert Wolf, who the scoreboard in the stadium is named after him, and he was the CEO of UBS, or Hank Paulson, who was an all-star football player in college, or John Roberts, the current Supreme Court Justice, who was the captain of his high school football team. What about the success stories or the benefits that playing football brings?
Well, I guess the question is, does playing a sport like football have benefits that are different from playing a sport that doesn't pose neurological, the potential of neurological injury? So is there anything special about playing football that you get that you wouldn't get from playing soccer, or from running track, or from rowing crew, or from doing anything else where people don't repeatedly bash each other over the head? And I would say that the things that you're pointing to about football, which I think totally exist, by playing a competitive sport, you learn. I'm someone who was an athlete in college. By playing a competitive sport, you learn so much about discipline, about the wonders of teamwork, about being competitive. All those kinds of things are extraordinarily important lessons. But you don't have to put yourself at permanent risk of neurological damage to get those lessons. There are things you can do that don't involve this, right? And that's all I'm saying. We can have, why doesn't Penn decide to have the greatest soccer team in the United States? And use that as the medium for teaching those lessons and for raising money from alumni. No one's forcing you to keep playing this stupid game.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Hi, Malcolm. Thank you for the compelling talk. I have a more general question about proof. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, do you think, based on what you said, absolute proof should not be a reason for someone to believe or not believe in God?
Oh, in God?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's a question I had not anticipated. Well, as someone, well, I should say that as someone who comes from a very, very religious family, I would say I don't think that any of my family members would say that they require absolute proof to believe in God. I think they are satisfied with their own faith, and that the existence of God has met whatever evidence they need to live a Christian life, and that they would say that absolute proof in that instance is impossible to find. I think that's actually a very reasonable position. In most cases, absolute certainty is not something we're ever going to find. We have to learn how to make sense of our lives in the absence of that kind of perfect evidence.
So what about for you?
For me, well, I'm not a believer in quite the same way as my family, and probably because I have different standards for what I consider to be evidence of that sort. But I have enormous respect for their position.
Thank you.
Hi, Malcolm. My name is Ada. I'm a senior. I just want to say I just learned about CTE today in class, so I thought that was really interesting. But in regards to putting in place certain policies on protecting student athletes, how do you address the financial ramifications? I know you said that they don't serve any function to society because it is entertainment, but entertainment is a financial function. And I think Super Bowl is a great example of that. 200 million people see it every year. If we pick it, and say this is bad and this caused like a snowball effect, how can we address that? How can we, combat that?
Well, I guess I'd say a number of things. One is that I'm very, very specifically talking about the place of football at educational institutions. So if grown men want to make millions of dollars a year and risk long-term neurological damage in so doing, I can't say I'm fine with that, but I don't think I'm going to try and stop them, whatever, right? My issue is whether when you bring in 18-year-old boys and you put them through this kind of when you put them at risk for their own health, for essentially the entertainment function of alumni and fellow students, and to use as an arm-raising tool for the university, I think that's irresponsible. So it's very specific, the moral environment in which a university ought to operate is fundamentally different from the moral environment in which businesses operate. And look, when they let you in here, the people who run this university, they took responsibility for you. And they do that, they fulfill that responsibility in 1,000 different ways. 99% of those responsibilities are fulfilled brilliantly, right? But it's just struck me there's a big glaring contradiction in the middle, and I think it's time to resolve it.
Thank you.
Hi, Malcolm. I'm Bishwa.
You're allowed to call me Malcolm.
After listening to your talk, I'm not sure where I stand on banning football in universities. But the question that I have for you is, we give people the right to choose whether or not they want to smoke cigarettes at the age of 18. Why should we then curtail their freedom to choose to participate in an activity that can be considered dangerous and risky? And where do we draw the line then? Yeah.
Good question. Two answers. One is the analogy is not to whether people can choose to smoke cigarettes. The analogy would be if the university selected a group of cigarette smokers every year, put them in a stadium, surrounded them with 40,000 alumni and students, and said, we would like you to smoke ferociously for an hour and a half in order to further the fundraising arm of our institution. Now, I'm all for someone having a smoke outside if they want one. Fine with me, doesn't bother me. But that other scenario is the one that I have difficulty with.
Hey, Malcolm. I just have a question, not based on what you said, because I agree with that 100%, but how you say it and where you say it. So, I mean, gathering the courage to come to Penn and bash everything that Penn stands for in the sports way, That's something I mean, when I read your books, my main, tipping point, or I guess like sparking moment, was not what you said, but the way you thought and the way you did it. And it's not flattery, but rather I really want to learn and understand, how do you gain the courage to come to a school and bash their sports? That's point number one. And point number two, if you spoke to them, if you tried it, and you did such an influential person, what can we do, and how do we get started? So,
Yeah.
Point one, point two.
Well, first I would say this, I don't think this was a terribly courageous talk. It would have been courageous if I had given this talk at spring football practice before the football team. That, I would say, I would have got some points for that. The second thing, what should you do? Look, every major, and I'm not putting football on the same level as other ones, but if you look at the recent history of the United States, every major social movement for good in this country has at some point had at its heart the activities and the conscience of people in college. The Vietnam War was fought by people like you. The civil rights movement was the people who staffed the civil rights movement, who went down to the South to protest against Jim Crow, were people like you. I could go on and on and on. Time and time again, it's people like you who have provided the moral ammunition to fight these sort of battles. And this is exactly where to start. There is no one better positioned to take up this cause. There's nothing else that's going to convince the administration to take a second look at football than if undergraduates stop going to the games. If the only people at a Quaker football game were 1,500 70-year-old white guys smoking cigars, it's over for football, right? It's not going to happen any longer. So the change has to come from you. There's no other. It's not going to be legislated in. It's not the. If you think Harrisburg is going to step in and stop this, you're crazy, right? So I think it just has to be the collective decisions of all of you. Just start a boycott. It's not that hard. I don't know how many of you go to games, but I imagine some of you do. Just stop going. Right? It's not, that's how these things get started.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Gladwell. So I'm a graduate student here, and so I've had probably like 6 to 10 years of straight academic stress. I'm sure a lot of students here have had the same. And there's this recent article by Chuck Klosterman about Royce White's basketball player who was anxiety disorder and mentally ill, and he had this claim that everyone was mentally ill in America, or at least a vast majority, because of the stresses and the demands that capitalism have risen in all of us. So from the academic and the just general American lifestyle point of view, how do you respond to those kind of claims? And connecting it to football, do you think our greed of loving football is connected to our mental illness?
Well, even I wouldn't go that far. I think that's a little bit. I read that piece. I think what he was, and he's a remarkably thoughtful guy. I think what he meant was that we underestimate the amount of stress that we're under. I think saying that we're all mentally ill is a step too far. But I think he's right to point out that it's foolish to ignore the fact that many people in this country, particularly those who come from less advantaged backgrounds, live their lives under an extraordinary burden of stress. And that explains an awful lot of what is troubling and pathological and traumatic about the experience of growing up poor in this country, or growing up in a broken home, or growing up with a parent in prison, or any of the other things that we know are. That's what he's saying. He's like, don't pretend that it's normal for a lot of people in this country, because it's not. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, that is a profoundly different psychological experience than if you have a job that pays you well and you know you're going to be comfortable till the rest of your life. So in that sense, I think that he was onto something. I would connect this to football only that what connects those two things is that there is this weird strain of indifference that we have under certain circumstances to the suffering of others. We try to be good about that, but sometimes we miss. And I feel with football, because the people who play it, at the moment they're playing it, are so healthy and such kind of extraordinary examples of physical prowess. It's impossible for us to understand that going on inside their head may be something that is terrifying and irreversible and fatal. And we need to get over that. We need to stop pretending that because someone looks like they are the picture of health, that they actually are. That just requires a leap of empathy that we've had difficulty with so far.
Thanks.
Hi there, Malcolm. Thank you for coming. So the primary comparison that you made for football was obviously mining in the early 20th century. And the solution in that scenario was not to completely eliminate mining, but was to take measures to make it safer. And I don't have statistics on this, but the sense I have is that mining is still a more dangerous than average profession, but one with sort of a level of risk that we've deemed to be somewhat acceptable. So why is it that your solution for the problem of football is to eliminate it entirely as opposed to working to take measures to make the game safer?
Good question. My position is that football, we should stop playing it until we discover whether there is a safer version we can play. So if you can prove, and this time I really do want proof, if you can prove to me that it can be played in a way that does not expose players to an undue level of long-term neurological damage, I say bring it back. Now, maybe that means playing flag football. I'll watch flag football. I mean, I don't have a problem with it. To me, I don't think, but maybe some people do. I'm sure that there are a lot of fans who have a problem with that. So, look, if you can fix it, fine. But the question is, what do you do while you're trying to discover, A, the extent of the problem, and B, how to fix it? Do you keep playing, or do you take a timeout? And my point is, you don't keep playing if you don't know what the extent of the problem is. What if we discovered that 20% of football players have CTE? Then keeping playing while we figure out that fact is a moral abomination, right? And if we discover that it's 0.0001%, and actually we've identified all the people who ever had it, then we can happily go back to play and stop being so worried about it. But to my mind, if you're an educational institution, there is no justification for continuing to play in the absence of some degree of knowledge about the extent of the problem. It's fine if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers, whatever, but not if you're Penn, right? Why would you do that? And the second issue along these same lines is, by continuing to do that, you are opening the door up to all kinds of other problems, like lawsuits. If you don't think the lawsuits are coming around the corner, you're wrong. And when they come, you know what's going to happen? That money's going to come out of your pocket. You're paying tuition. You're funding this place. Do you want your tuition to go up because you're paying for legal fees incurred by a portion of the school that has nothing whatsoever to do with its educational function? If I were you, I'd be outraged by that. My money going to pay off some liability lawyer who's suing over a game I don't care about, right? So that's another thing to consider. Until we know, it's just not worth it.
Hi, Malcolm. Thank you for speaking today. I play football here. I'm a senior.
I was going to say.
You might be able to tell.
Yeah.
I obviously disagree with a lot of stuff you say. Obviously, I'm well aware of the risks of CTE, of football. I knew Owen well. I'm trying to continue to playing football professionally. I'm well aware of that, of the risks that are inherent with playing football. I don't think anyone on the team isn't aware of that. You said like you could play other sports. I don't see myself 6'5", 300 pounds, playing soccer or running track. Football opens a lot of opportunities for students. I personally wouldn't have been able to get into an Ivy League school without football, and it's kind of opened up further doors for myself. I'm sure that's the same at other schools across the country as well. So you say Penn, you're an elite institution. Football shouldn't be here because it's such a violent sport. At the same time, it's opened a lot of opportunities for myself and other players. And you said that nothing's being done by the school. They actually had a few rule changes, concussion protocols changed. I've seen it change my time. Obviously, it's not major steps towards addressing it. Same thing has happened at the NFL level with doctors and outside people have to come in and review players. I want to know what your thoughts are on like the minor rule changes, especially in terms of like at the younger level where they're teaching kids how to tackle differently, how to play differently, not to lead with the head. I want to, what's your thought if that can continue, help football continue?
Yeah. Couple of responses. One is that The issue of these concussion protocols is we don't know how important they are, how much they solve the problem, because as I said, we don't know whether the issue is concussions or repetitive subconcussive impact. If the issue is really the 1,000 little hits, not the 2 big hits that you get a season, then there's not much a concussion protocol can do. We don't have the answer to that question yet. And so once again, I happen to believe until you know the answer to that question, you have to stop. Others may disagree. The second thing I would say is that you're absolutely right that football creates a series of opportunities for a class of people. It is impossible to take away any activity and not harm somebody. The question is, you have to weigh the harm that we create by canceling football against the benefit. And in this case, I think the unknown risks are far greater than the benefits that are currently accrue to people such as yourself. Again, you may differ. The third thing is that I have nothing wrong with an ongoing attempt being made by the sport of football to clean up its act. I think that's appropriate. I think it's moving too slowly, but they should do that. The issue, the core issue, is what Penn should do while that ongoing cleanup effort occurs. I think they should sit on the sidelines because I didn't see any point for them to participate. So I have no problem with you playing football. I just have a problem with you playing football at Penn. And that's an important distinction.
Fair enough.
Hi, Malcolm. My question kind of follows up on that. Originally in your talk, you did not differentiate, as you have in the question and answer period, the university setting. And when you were doing your talk, you talked about one of the options was for someone to sign off on a sheet that says, I know what the risks are, and I'm okay with it. Sort of like that gentleman said he was willing to do. He's doing exactly as you said, weighing the risks and benefits. Mm-hmm. He's decided that it's okay with him to take that risk. First of all, I wanted to ask you why you have a problem with that in particular. And I understand now with the university setting. But the other thing that struck me, and I have to admit I'm a lawyer, is as part of that, you then said that the university would have to take on the responsibility of paying for a wrongful death action if that were to occur. And I want to understand why that is a necessary given in your mind if the person has assumed the risk.
Because the harm is caused by the game of football that's being played on campus. If I give you a scholarship to come and play and have a football program, which I believe in because I believe it accrues all kinds of larger benefits to the university, then it strikes me I have a responsibility towards those who play, right? You're playing because there's all kinds of things I want. I like the football program for what it does for my image, for my fundraising, whatever. I have conscripted a series of people to play. Yes, we should make them aware of the risks. But two, you can't walk away. You can't just say, accept the risks or not. If you do, my hands are clean. Your hands aren't clean. If someone accepts the risks of playing, then the university has to step in and accept the risks accept the responsibility of caring for that person if they get sick. You know, you get 1,000 hits to the head over the course of a football season. Someone plays 4 years at Penn means 4,000 hits, right? If we determine that 4,000 hits are in some cases enough to get CTE, look, the university that asks you to play football ought to chip in. That strikes me as a really, really small thing to ask, right? And I don't think you can wash your hands of that responsibility.
Thank you.
Yeah. One last question, and then we'll...
Hello, Mr. Gladwell. Thank you very much for speaking today. Something that you said that struck me particularly was that we need to learn to act in the absence of absolute proof. But you also listed many examples of where in society today, larger corporations and individuals are very reluctant to do so and that we use them as excuses. So my question to you is, how do we as a society learn to be more willing to act without absolute evidence?
That's the crucial question, right? I don't know if there is a simple answer. I just think you have to be conscious of the fact that as a human being, your responsibility is to keep your conscience alive. You can't shut it down for your own convenience. You have to be aware that your actions have consequences, that going to a football game is voting for, in a sense, voting for football. And you don't have to do that if you don't want to. And you can stand up and say, I don't want to vote for it, and I don't think we should continue to do this. It's just a matter of keeping those kinds of considerations in the forefront and not letting them be buried in the back. Well, thank you all very much.
On the way to taking Malcom Gladwell to dinner, I'm reminded of the best definition of an intellectual I think I ever heard. It's someone that bites the hand that feeds them. Lots of food for thought tonight. Thank you so much for coming, Malcom. We appreciate it.